My dad served in the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1967. For the longest time, he didn't tell anyone outside of the family this story. But he's in his mid-80s now, and he doesn't care about me sharing it with anyone. Not that I intend to release any of our names. I've heard this story told by him 5 times now, and each time I learn about new details he hadn't mentioned the time before. He didn't like to tell this story for obvious reasons. I think not only is thinking back to any of those events probably traumatizing, but also he would always say he felt it would be an inappropriate family gathering discussion. My dad did a lot of things in the war. At one point, he was what was known as a tunnel rat, which was a soldier who performed underground search and destroy missions, usually in underground tunnels. My dad and 2 of his comrades were crawling through a deep tunnel, expecting to hit a booby trap or run into an ambush, but the tunnels were surprisingly empty and silent. My dad describes the experience of crawling through the silent dark tunnels as bone-chilling and adrenaline-pumping, as the fear of instant death at any moment would linger. My dad and his comrades heard a faint yelling and crying sound further down the tunnels. It was of a woman. As they crawled deeper into the tunnels, the cries and screams became more clear. It was obvious there was a woman screaming for help. The 3 picked up their pace, worried about a potential hostage or prisoner situation. As they continued to crawl through the tunnels, the cries for help got a little louder and clearer. They arrived at a small room that they could slightly get off their knees in. The ceiling was just high enough to half stand, half crouch. There was a small table with a lantern on it that was still lit. There were also 2 broken chairs and a locked safe box with some metallic objects that would rattle around inside the box when shaken. Aside from that, this small room was empty. However, the tunnel continued past this room, so they continued deeper into the tunnel, but the screams for help had stopped at this point. My dad described this horrible, familiar stench of death that soon became overwhelming in the tunnels. They entered one final room with no further tunnels. My dad still refuses to describe everything that was in this room in detail other than there were multiple bodies, and they weren't killed by just bullets. They looked as though they'd been mutilated by some kind of creature. One of the bodies was that of a woman. The scene was so horrible that my dad and the 2 other tunnel rats had to turn around and flee. They had no explanation for what could have done what was seen in that room. When they crawled back out of the tunnels, they started hearing the cries for help from that woman's voice again. My dad says he and his comrades froze and looked at each other with wide eyes and obvious fear on their faces. They had made it to the end of that tunnel. There were no living things from there to the end of it, yet those screams for help were coming from the direction that they just were. They picked up their pace even more. My dad was in the back of the group of 3, and he says he would look back every 10 seconds, thinking he was hearing sounds from behind him, fearing he would see someone or something approaching from the darkness. They made it back to the surface eventually and marked the entrance with a flag that signified to his team that the tunnel had been searched and cleared. Most tunnels would be interconnecting as a means of underground transportation and cover, but my dad says this tunnel was unusual to abruptly end. He says it was easily the most gut-wrenching, horrific, nightmare-inducing thing he'd experienced in his entire 2 years in Vietnam. I chose a very poor time to join the army. The plan was to join the army as an engineer, serve for a few years, then use the money and skills I'd build up to open an auto repair shop over. I signed on for a 6-year minimum contract, but then 2 years in, Australia got involved in Vietnam. We'd had advisors in before that, working to train up the South Vietnamese, but no one expected it to escalate in such a way. I certainly didn't, anyway. And if it did, I thought being an engineer would keep me out of harm's way, for the most part at least. But oh, how wrong I was. In late 1967, I was summoned to the office of my company commander, and when I arrived in his office, he had a sheet of paper in front of him. He gave me a look over, then asked me if I was indeed just 5 foot 5 inches tall and 70 kilos. I told him yes, that I'd always been short and skinny, but that I'd passed all the relevant Army tests as well as meeting all the minimum height and weight requirements. And that's what I thought it was about. You see, I got it into my head that they were trying to kick me out because of my smaller stature. It turns out that quite the opposite was true. The Army wanted men of my size very badly indeed, and that's because of a very special kind of job that only we could perform, a job that would earn us the name tunnel rats. Along with about 100 other guys, I was sent back to the Army School of Military Engineering near Sydney, where we underwent a 3-month crash course in what was called tunnel clearance. To counter the threat of air power, the Vietnamese communists had taken to living underground as a means of avoiding detection. It was such an effective technique that our ground forces were forced to come up with a means of flushing them out. We tried everything: grenades, dogs, tear gas. The Yanks even tried flooding them with water at one point. But the only thing we sent down those holes that was really effective were people. And to fit down there, you needed to be short and skinny, just like I was. We crawled through a few replica tunnels the instructors had built, but the meat and potatoes came down to the kind of combat we were told to expect. Most of the fighting in Vietnam was in really dense jungle, and from a lot of the stories I heard, you rarely got a look at the Viet zone during a firefight. But in the case of us tunnel rats, we would be getting up close and personal with the enemy, so close you could touch them, in fact. More often than not, you had no choice but to lay hands on them because the fighting down in those tunnels was quite literally hand-to-hand. You went down into the tunnels with a handgun, a flashlight, and a knife, sometimes a rope to tug on if you needed help, but that's about it. You could use the handgun if you really needed to, but shooting in such a dark and enclosed space could really mess up your eyes and ears, so it was always a last resort kind of thing. The enemy tended to just flee if they knew we were in the tunnels, and we'd post blocking forces to try and cut off their escape. But every so often, you had to get your hands dirty. Ideally, you wanted to sneak up on a bloke, clamp your hand over his mouth, and stab the Jesus out of him before he knew what was happening. That way, you could either keep going or go back to warn the rest of your mates without the enemy knowing you were there. But after a while, the enemy got wise to what we were doing, and they really wanted to take us out of the game. They started building booby traps into the walls of the tunnels, mostly things like tripwire grenades. But some tunnels had false walls or floors where the Viet could hide before plunging a bamboo spear into our bellies. There was even one instance where an American tunnel rat claimed to have found a booby trap consisting entirely of live snakes. The had dug out a little hole in the bottom of one tunnel, then tossed some highly venomous pit vipers in there. There were even mouse or rat droppings dotting the little enclosure where they had clearly been feeding them rodents to keep them alive. They started doing a lot of that sort of thing after the tunnel clearance program really got going, just baiting us sometimes so they could kill our blokes. We heard that a Viet zone got a big-time reward for killing a tunnel rat, and rightly so. It wasn't like you could train any soldier to do the job. The army only had a finite supply of smaller, skinnier soldiers blokes, and the more we lost, the more strain the job put on you. We were also faced with a massive problem when it came to taking casualties. 90% of the time, if the Viets got the better of a tunnel rat, he was a goner. But we couldn't just leave the bodies down there, we had to recover them. The same thing applied if a bloke was wounded, we had to send another man down there to drag them out. This was obviously very dangerous, as the Viets were experts at setting traps and ambushes. So, trying to rescue one guy might result in 2 or 3 other tunnel rats being killed or wounded in the process. And that's how I ended up buying my ticket home in June of 1969. Me and another tunnel rat we called Victor were flown from our base at Nui Dat to a place called Kawa Chai. We'd be joining the 5th Battalion of the Royal France Regiment for what they were calling Operation Esso, which amounted to a month's worth of mine disposal and tunnel clearance in the area of Kawa Chai. We worked staggered shifts in teams of 2, and that day was our day, so off we went. The moment we landed, some infantry sergeant ran up to the helicopter and told us we were needed at a tunnel system about 2 kilometers from the landing zone. They had been mapping out the tunnel system for weeks, making a note of all the entrances they could find. They weren't easy to locate either, being these small holes with wood panel covers that were very easily concealed. Anyway, they mapped out the tunnels, put a few blocking forces in place, and all we needed to do was flush out the Viet Som so the other platoons could pick them off. When we arrived at the entrance the sergeant wanted us to start with, Victor told me he wanted to be the first one in so he could at least get a feel for the place before we both went down together, if it even came to that. He went down, rope tied around the hand, holding his pistol with him, and said that he'd be back in a few minutes. But then a few minutes went by, and there was no sign of Victor. As you can probably imagine, the rope that he held kept extending and extending as he moved forward, so we knew everything was A-okay. Every so often, the rope would stop for a few seconds where Victor was just waiting and listening or checking out his surroundings, I assume, but it would always start moving again in a moment or two. But then it stopped and didn't start moving again. After I gave the line a few tugs and Victor didn't tug back, I really started to worry. I tried my best to wait a few minutes before heading down. I hadn't heard any gunshots or anything that might indicate he was in trouble, but him being so still for so long wasn't a good sign. After a minute or so ticked by and there was still no movement, I got down into the tunnel myself to check on Victor. Generally speaking, there were two kinds of tunnels here. The larger tunnels connected all the various underground facilities the Viet Som had down there. They had field hospitals, armories, even bloody classrooms so their leaders could indoctrinate them with all that bloody Marxism stuff. But then there were the smaller tunnels, the kind closer to the surface where you literally had to crawl along on your belly to get anywhere, and it was this kind that I found myself in that morning. It was pitch black, and I didn't need to use my flashlight. All I had to do to find Victor was follow the rope he was holding. So, that's what I did, moved as quiet as a mouse, just hoping I wasn't about to crawl into a trap. Eventually, after a couple of minutes of crawling, I felt my hand touch the bottom of Victor's boot. I stayed quiet as I gave it a nudge, but Victor didn't move. He was dead, probably killed by some Viet Som who then ran off to warn his mates. If that was the case, then job done, the blocking forces could do their thing. It just seemed unfair that the result came at the cost of my mate's life. To make sure that there was nothing restricting Victor's body before I tried to pull it out, I switched on my flashlight to take a look around. The smaller tunnels were tiny, but there was just about enough room to lift your head up a little bit. That way, I could use my flashlight to look ever so slightly over Victor's body. But when I did, it resulted in the single most heart-stopping moment of terror I had ever experienced. I didn't get a good look at the bloke, I didn't have time, really. But when I switched on my flashlight, there was this Viet Som on the other side of Victor's body, and he had a pistol aimed right at my flashlight. I dropped down straight away, trying to get as low as possible. The guy must have shot where the light was, and I know I must have blinded him a bit, so his first few shots went over me. I know this because I felt the earth hitting the back of my neck from where the Viet Som's bullets were smashing into the tunnel ceiling. The noise was deafening, well and truly, and as much as I saw the flashes from where he kept on shooting at me, I didn't really hear the shots, not properly, anyway. The only thing that kept his bullets from killing me was Victor's body, and if he wasn't dead when I found him, it certainly was by the time it came to dragging him out. The guy shooting at me quickly extended his pistol clip and had to back out of the tunnel to rearm. When I carried on dragging Victor's body the opposite way, I could hear the bloke shouting for his friends in Vietnamese, and I knew it was only a matter of time before more bullets came flying in my direction. All I could do was focus on dragging Victor, telling myself I still might be able to save his life if I just get him out of that bloody tunnel in time. I could hear the rest of my mates shouting on the surface. They'd heard the gunfire and were willing me to drag myself out of the tunnel in one piece. I almost made it out without a scratch too, but as I reached the tunnel entrance and raised myself up to climb out, I heard another round of muffled gunfire before a bullet smashed into my left knee. I know it belongs to get themselves shot, and because of all the adrenaline, they don't feel a bloody thing unless it breaks a bone or something. Jesus Christ, the pain I felt when my kneecap shattered into a dozen little pieces was like nothing I'd ever felt before or since. If it wasn't for the guys who grabbed me under the armpits and dragged me out of that hole, I might have already lost one or both legs to a spray of Chinese-supplied bullets. Like I might have already said, that bullet wound was my ticket home. I was flown back, stitched up, put into a rehab program, and then I was back on duty. Thankfully, I didn't have to go back overseas, but I did serve about 18 more months teaching tunnel rats how to do that job. This particular story took place when I was in the Air Force and stationed in Louisiana. This story took place a few years after I had been stationed there. I first arrived at this base in 2005, and upon my arrival, I, along with many other new troops, were greeted with many different stories of horror. There were stories about a man in a top hat who walked a dark, long, and narrow dirt road on the outskirts of a storage facility area. There was another story about a crazy man who was hit by a patrol car and ran off into the woods next to the same place. But my story relates to a separate story that was told to me. It was my second night on shift, as I recall. I was posted with an airman who had been there for several years. He gave a rundown about some little girl who had been visiting her father when the storage area we were working in was being constructed, which was well before any of our time. The story went that the little girl was playing on some of the structures while her father was working but had fallen to her death by slipping off the edge at the top of the structure itself. Most of the story didn't make sense to me at the time, but regardless of the facts, it still scared the out of me. To make matters worse, the airman had taken me to the exact place where the supposed story took place. He would shut off the engine and turn off the music as we just sat there in silence. He startled me a few times, but nothing ever happened. Now skip forward about 3 years. I was scheduled to work that particular spot of the base this night. Keep in mind that I'd been visiting this spot for years now, but at this point, the storage area had been completely closed down except for a few minor areas, which required us to do physical drive-thrus and checks of this area. The shift itself started out rather shitty. Me and my Steven partner had been given a cattle truck to do this patrol, as our normal vehicle was in the shop for maintenance. Yeah, I'm not kidding, but cattle truck. I know this part doesn't seem very important to the story at the moment, but it will tie into the story eventually. So to save on time, let's skip forward a few hours. We were scheduled to do 3 random checks of the storage facility that night, and we had already completed 2 of the 3 prior without any issues. So, come about 4 o'clock in the morning, we decided to do our last check. Seeing as all the main maintenance guys had gone home for the night in this area, the only way to access the area was with 2 very large separate gates, which took forever to open. We piled in, locked the gates behind us, and continued on our way. Steven was driving during this check, and I was the spotter who used the flashlight to check the lock on each structure. An important detail that I left out, which may be necessary here, is that the story of the little girl had taken place on a road within the storage area, which we called Echo Street. By this point, everything was fine, and we had finished our rounds. Steven made the final turn down Echo Street. We had both been pretty talkative during most of the night, and we were just shooting when I got an uneasy feeling. Something felt different, but I couldn't make out what it was. We were about halfway down the road when things became almost completely and frighteningly silent. Even the rumble of our cattle truck and the faint noise of the radio playing seemed to become less audible as we approached the structure from my previous story. And I must stress at this point that even telling or typing this part still brings a chill down my spine and makes my eyes tear up in fear. But as we approached the structure itself, I turned my head to the outside of the window opposite the structure, and out of my left ear, I heard a sound that nearly caused me to piss myself. It was the sound of a person groaning or moaning in distress, sort of like the moan of the girl from The Grudge. Yes, I'm very serious. The faint, creepy moan began to ring inside the cab of the truck between the 2 of us, in between the dark emptiness of the middle seat. I felt my blood turn cold, and I quickly turned to Steven and yelled, "Dude, cut that out." Steven turned to me with a confused look on his face. At this point, he began to take his foot off the accelerator and asked, "Am I going too fast?" I remained silent for a moment, with my hand in a pausing gesture, and I listened. I heard the noise again. My partner interrupted and asked, "What's wrong?" I quickly turned the music off without saying anything at first, and then I whispered to him, "Do you hear that?" He stopped the truck in confusion and listened closely. It was almost dead silent for a second or two when we both heard at this time that long, chilling groan of a woman. It echoed in my ears. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe and taking in a giant breath of air while someone was trying to strangle them. The sound was beyond terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one hearing it only made it more of a horrifying experience. I found myself beginning to ask him my original question again, but he quickly interrupted and said with a strong sound of fear in his voice, "What the is that?" We stupidly waited to see if we could hear it again. The rumble of the gates on the back of the truck was easily heard and recognized as they made a sort of metal-on-metal clatter, and the diesel engine had that typical rumble as well. But in between both the noises, we heard it again for the final time, that groan. It sounded even louder, but this time it sounded like it was coming from both inside and outside of the truck, like we were being surrounded by whatever was making that noise of distress. Without even making a peep, Stephen put the truck in drive, and he hauled our asses off that street quicker than I have ever gone on any other street, and that entire base veered us off the road to speed back. He nearly flipped the truck going around a curve, but it didn't bother us one bit. We were both in an unspoken agreement that we wanted to get out of there quickly. We got to the 2 gates again, and I hopped out of the truck as fast as I could. Stephen watched my back as I quickly opened both gates. He jumped back into the driver's seat, sped out, and waited for me to close both gates as well. Once we completed that task, we quickly returned to the main part of the base, and we requested to meet with our flight chief to tell him what had happened. When we finally met up with him, we expected him to think that we were both full of it or that we had just imagined the entire thing, being as it was so late into our 12-hour shift and we were both tired. But I clearly remember him saying to both of us, "I completely believe you." As a matter of fact, I had something like that happen to me twice, once in that same place and the other in that building behind you, as he pointed at our jailhouse. Again, I know that sounds completely cliché with that grudge-like moan we had heard, but it honestly happened, and it still brings those tears of fright into my eyes every time I tell it. I went back to that storage area only once after that, but I never went down that road again, and I never went after dark. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.